Mr. Chairman, I suggest that Representative Crockett publicly share her complete college transcript so that voters have the ability to judge the academic credibility of those who create our laws. The words dropped like an unexpected blow in the middle of an otherwise steady hearing. J.D. Vance speaking in a calm tone. Eyes fixed directly on Jasmine Crockett wasn't grinning. Nor was there any trace of just joking. It was a formal appeal delivered during a national committee meeting. The room turned quiet. J.D. Vance ridiculed Jasmine Crockett's stories. Several journalists stood up and adjusted their recorders. Jasmine remained seated, no flinch, no reply. She softly closed her notebook, then lifted her head to look at J.D., not with outrage, not with stress, just a stare that seemed used to the critical eyes, the so-called political integrity, demands that often subtly hides deep-rooted bias. J.D. went on slowly. This is nothing against her, but if I, someone from a modest background, was once challenged about my qualifications, then it's only fair we apply the same criteria to everyone. A few slight nods came from the back rows. Someone jotted hurried notes. Cameras from multiple news networks began shifting their attention from J.D. to Jasmine, then froze on her face, blank, no grin, no trace of being rattled. No one interjected. No. One stepped forward. And maybe because of that, someone in the audience began to lean toward J.D.'s argument. Only Jasmine stayed unmoved, hands placed on the table, eyes locked on her challenger, as if she sensed some things don't need to be spoken right away because someone else would respond for at the right moment, and loud enough to be impossible to miss. If you've ever seen someone being questioned because of where they came from, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from? And if you believe that truth doesn't need to be yelled, just spoken by the right voice, hit subscribe and stay with us to tell the stories that truly deserve to be shared. The hearing that day was not streamed live from the beginning. It was originally a themed conversation organized by the House Committee on Education and the Workforce under the topic Equity and Access to Higher Education and Fair Academic Evaluation Standards. Jasmine Crockett was invited as a featured guest, one of the few Black female lawmakers who studied law, rose from public schools, and received a full scholarship. J.D. Vance, senator from Ohio, was there as a counter-speaker, representing a legislative group pushing to re-examine existing college admission policies. They were not strangers. They had earlier appeared together on a CNN panel titled, "Does Success Come from Drive or Privilege?" At the time, J.D. made his argument clear. I grew up in a family wrecked by addiction where no one attended college. I know what it feels like to conquer adversity, Jasmine replied plainly. And I grew up in a place where hardship wasn't a phase, it was the norm. But I never used that to ask for pity. From that point on, they stood on opposite ends. J.D. used poverty to validate his merit. Jasmine refused to use her history to gain sympathy. That basic contrast made them rival symbols in debates on fairness and merit in today's hearing. Tension didn't rise from words, but from the way they looked at each other. Jade entered the room with a bold stride, adjusted his blue tie, and offered a slight smile when he saw Jasmine already seated. She didn't glance at him, but no one in the room could miss the current charge between them. The participants that day represented a broad range: educators, student leaders, parents from different states, and notably many political reporters, most of whom hadn't paid much notice to academic equity until they heard Jasmine and J.D. would be appearing right. From his first remarks, J.D. subtly wove the message he intended to send. I believe in learning, but I don't believe merit can be assigned based on race or gender. When we adjust admission rules just to achieve diversity, we trade off quality, and that's unfair to those who genuinely work hard. No direct reactions were heard, but a few people nodded in support. Jasmine didn't cut in. When it was her moment, she spoke clearly. I don't stand for a race. I stand for the truth. And the truth is many people like me have had to push twice as hard just to be viewed as average. If there's injustice, it's not in admission rules. It's in the belief that we don't belong. Neither of them said the other's name, but everyone understood. A conservative seated in the front row leaned over and whispered, "Where did she go to law school?" Howard Spellman, one of those, a young journalist, Googled her and went quiet upon discovering that Jasmine had been a top performer at the University of Texas School of Law, recipient of a National Essay Award on Constitutional Conflict and Civil Rights. Politico once printed a single sentence about her. The woman who made the full Judiciary Committee reopen dormant investigation files with a 12-minute rebuttal. In contrast, there's a rarely known fact about J.D. in his final term of law school. He once applied for a semester leave for personal reasons approved as a special allowance. The media didn't investigate. No one challenged it because he was the man who climbed from poverty. And people don't question narratives that match an inspirational storyline. Nothing was spoken aloud, but that mood led the audience to silently wonder who has been questioned more. Jasmine sat in the middle of the room, hands gently placed on the table, in them only a notepad and a blue ink pen. I glanced at her once before the cameras began. She didn't respond, just a stare, quiet but sharp as a blade. A political commentator leaned over and whispered to a peer, "They're not debating, but this isn't a hearing, it's a chess match, and it feels like J.D. just made a careless move." When J.D. asked for her transcript, the room was taken off guard, but Jasmine, as usual, didn't blink. Because some people know if you carry enough truth, you don't need to scream. And if politics can ignore the truth, intellect cannot. J.D. Vance adjusted the microphone, his voice calm and intentionally slow, as if stepping into a part of the hearing he had carefully prepared for. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, scanning the room with his eyes, "I'm not here to make personal attacks. I'm here to raise fair question. Are we trusting our lawmakers, the ones shaping the future of American education, because they have real academic merit, or simply because they have a powerful story?" The instant the question ended, the sound of rapid typing spread. Through the press section, a few people in the room nodded. Others scowled. Jay didn't let the pause last. He pulled out a printed document and held it up. "This is an anonymous post from the platform EduLeaks, where former classmates and professors share insight on the academic records of public officials who attended law school. In this post, someone claiming to be a former instructor questions the accuracy of Representative Jasmine Crockett's transcript, specifically whether any unique exceptions were made during her graduation process." A murmur rose from the left section of the room. Jasmine still remained silent. She merely tilted her head slightly, her eyes focused on the paper. J.D. was holding. A committee member asked, "Is that an official reference?" J.D. answered, "I'm not saying it's completely verified, but I do believe it's worth exploring, especially since we're here to discuss admission policies and academic results." At this moment, all cameras slowly redirected attention toward Jasmine. She didn't grin. She didn't rush to speak. She simply flipped a page in the notebook before her and spoke in a tone calm, but clear enough to be picked up by every mic senator. "Vance, please explain. What exactly do you want me to prove? A grade, a ranking, or an entire life?" No one chuckled. No one applauded. But the question sliced directly through the polite surface of what had been framed as a respectful discussion. J.D. didn't retreat. On the contrary, he stepped closer. "If I was ever questioned about my history," he said, "I was ready to share it, good or bad. But when someone dodges answering a basic question, it's often because there's something to conceal." A wave of deep breaths moved through the room. Some people started to tilt toward J.D.'s side. A few nodded. Some murmured, "He's got a point." The divide in the room became sharper. The left side leaned toward Jasmine, the right favored J.D. A seasoned reporter scribbled into a notebook an academic clash disguised in fairness. Jasmine still didn't strike back. She raised her eyes and stared directly at J.D. for the first time during the hearing. Not with rage, but with enough strength to pause the next sentence forming in his mouth, and then the silence stretched until a noise broke it. A chair shifting as someone stood from the audience. A student, young slim, wearing a pale yellow guest badge, got up. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm and slightly shaking. "Excuse me, I'm a first-year law student. I didn't plan to speak, but if being a good student is the measure for making sound policy, then why are there people with impressive diplomas passing unjust laws?" The room turned completely silent. Some turned to look at him. Others turned toward J.D. No one responded. No one could. That question wasn't directed solely at J.D., but it disrupted the one-sided momentum that had turned in his favor. J.D. avoided the student's gaze. He looked down at the table and quickly attempted to recover by repeating, I'm simply asking whether Representative Crockett is willing to be transparent as I've always been. Boy. The statement no longer held the weight it once had. A woman in the third row wearing a tan blazer leaned to her companion and murmured, "That kid asked the one thing no one dared to." The shift wasn't obvious. It crept in like a slow tide, with eyes now beginning to examine JD's intentions. Not because he was incorrect, but because he was too precise, too smooth, like a carefully practiced media message. As for Jasmine, still quiet, her silence was no longer a shield. It had become a declaration. A PBS camera moved slowly to her hand, gripping a blue pen tightly. An academic commentator later wrote in a column, "That was the most powerful unspoken moment of the entire hearing, because while people argued about transcripts, someone quietly showed the truly educated know when to hold their answers and save them for a time that carries more meaning." And then just at that instant, something completely unplanned happened. A congressional aide approached the chair's desk and whispered something. The cameras didn't catch the words, but the expression on Chairwoman Sharon Jennings shifted from neutral to shocked. She looked up and tapped her microphone. "We've just been told that an unregistered guest has requested to speak as a supplemental witness, with information directly tied to the question raised by Senator Vance." She paused briefly and glanced at the name. "That person is Professor William Hart, former Dean of Law at the University of Texas." The room collectively held its breath. JD turned his head. Jasmine closed her eyes, not to hide anything, but as if she had sensed this moment would arrive. JD Vance took a deep breath, preparing to close his remarks with a carefully practiced line. "If we want our policymakers to reflect the best of our education system, then, at the very least, they should represent it." He looked up, his gaze landing on Jasmine, but before JD could speak, a voice rose from the back row. It wasn't loud, but just loud enough to bring the entire room to silence, I believe. I can answer that for her." Everyone turned. A tall man with silver hair and a steady step walked slowly from the back of the room. He wore a long coat, held a stack of papers in his left hand, and leaned on an old carved wooden cane with his right. No one identified him at first until the congressional aide confirmed Professor William Hart, former Dean of Law, University of Texas. JD froze. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, then quickly shifted toward the committee members. Jasmine didn't turn around. She simply exhaled as if releasing a stone that had been pressing on her chest. Professor Hart stepped to the middle of the room. He didn't need a mic. His voice was deep, slow, and clear enough that everyone listened. "I apologize for not signing in earlier, but I'm here as someone who has taught both central people in today's debate, Senator Vance and Representative Crockett." He paused, opened the folder carefully, and pulled out a single sheet yellowed with time but perfectly preserved in a plastic sleeve. "This is not a transcript. I didn't bring that. I brought something else." He held it up, a copy of Jasmine Crockett's senior thesis titled "Equal Under Law, Unequal in Practice, a Legal Fracture Below Her Name," winner of Best Legal Essay, 2013 Federal Civil Rights category. The hearing room was still. This essay was written while Jasmine's mother was in the hospital, in the last days of her life. I know this because, I was the one who approved her extension request. But she turned it down. She said, "If I can't write this while I'm in pain, then what's the point of writing law at all?" A soft sob broke from the back of the room. PBS cameras moved to a young female student wiping tears from her cheek. JD looked down at the table, his hands clenched. Saying nothing, Professor Hart continued, this time turning directly to JD. "I taught you too, Senator Vance. I wrote the letter that allowed you to rejoin the program after your family left. I don't regret that, but I say this now, not to shame anyone, but to restore fairness." To someone quiet far too long, he paused, then with a voice as steady as a gavel strike, he said, "I taught both of you, but only one of you ever used hardship as a reason to pause, and that person was not Jasmine." No one breathed. That sentence needed no explanation, no extra reasoning. It cut sharp, drawing a line through the room, not between right and wrong, but between success earned and success retold. Professor Hart said nothing more. He placed the essay on the hearing table, nodded gently to Jasmine, and turned to leave. No one clapped. No one stopped him. The air was too heavy, as if any movement might break the moment. JD stayed seated. He tried to hide the tension by clasping his hands. but the cameras caught his lips pressing his eyes. Cast downward for the first time that day, Jasmine still sat stow tears. No smile, but as Professor Hart walked past, she stood, said nothing, and bowed her head slightly. Not in thanks, but as a recognition, there are those who do not need to defend themselves with words, because when the truth is strong enough, someone will always rise to speak for it. The atmosphere in the hearing room after Professor Hart's remarks no longer felt like a debate. No one spoke. No one moved. Vance sat quiet. His hands rested on the table, but his thumb tapped slowly against the edge of his chair. A repeated motion of someone trying to stay calm. Cameras shifted their attention no longer on Jasmine, but now focused on JD. Tiny beads of sweat began to form. At his temple, instead of exiting immediately, Professor Hart turned slightly toward the chairwoman and spoke in a soft but unmistakably firm voice. "I don't want to say one line and walk away. I think I should finish the part that the media never bothers to ask about." A few people glanced up. Hart nodded slowly, his eyes never meeting JD's, but every word landed like it was being etched directly onto that man's image. In the spring semester of 2008, JD Vance, then a final year law student, sent me a long email asking to defer all his exams. In it, he explained he was facing a mild depression due to family issues. I agreed, and even said if necessary, I'd write a letter supporting a full semester off, because I've always believed sometimes what someone really needs is understanding, not a score. JD didn't respond. He tilted his head slightly downward, as if attempting to mask the pressure building across his brow. Professor Hart then slowly moved to a second document, and this was the request form submitted by Jasmine Crockett during that same period. Her mother was undergoing a third round of chemo. She didn't request to defer her paper, only asked to turn it in on the day of the exam, not earlier than the deadline. I remember when she submitted it. Her eyes were bloodshot, but she never once mentioned her mother. The cameras returned to Jasmine. She was still silent, still calm, but this time her gaze was fixed on Professor Hart, not seeking approval but silently confirming he spoke the truth. A Republican committee member, an older congressman, slightly shook his head and muttered, "No one ever told us this." That line, though quiet, triggered a ripple, like paint peeling off to reveal the raw wall underneath. A few who had nodded along with JD earlier now leaned back into their chairs, quiet, their silence no longer about listening to JD, but about reconsidering what they'd never questioned. A woman in the public gallery began crying. No sobbing, no scene, but those nearby could feel it. That woman was Marcia Reed, a former classmate of Jasmine's from their Constitutional Law 2 class. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue and whispered, loud enough for a C-SPAN cameraman to catch, "She used to sit beside me at 6 a.m. before the library even opened. I always thought she worked that hard out of drive. I didn't realize her mom was in the hospital." Professor Hart remained standing, but now his expression softened, like he was walking through a memory never shared. Wisdom isn't about where you came from. It's about what you offer others even when you're in pain. No applause followed, no commentary. The entire room sat motionless, like time had paused. A Reuters camera zoomed in on JD's face. For the first time, he couldn't hold a neutral look. His lips were tight, eyes low. A small shift, but one that every viewer on the live stream could feel. The energy shift was slow, but undeniable. A well-known New York Times journalist posted live, "We just watched someone use pain as an excuse, and someone else use pain as fuel." Some conservative pundits pushed back. One asked, "If Jasmine's that strong, why did she need someone else to speak up?" But most didn't reply. They knew that question didn't fit the room anymore. In the back, a young student live streaming the moment put his phone down and typed, "Today I learned something. Wisdom doesn't yell. It just needs the right person to share it at the right time." In the closing shot of this segment, the camera slowly moved back to Jasmine. She didn't speak, didn't say, "Thank you for defending me." She didn't show pride. She just picked up the thesis, the same copy Hart had placed there, and rested it gently in her lap. No one asked, "Do you want to say something?" because no one dared disturb the silence now thick with the real weight of justice. No one expected that a 3-minute, 48-second clip of Professor William Hart's short speech would become the week's biggest spark. Just 4 hours after the hearing, an anonymous TikTok account clipped the moment Hart said, "I taught both of them," but only one used hardship as a reason to stall, with the caption, "Who really deserves it?" That clip hit 3.2 million views in just 12 hours. Twitter checks exploded with hashtags like, "Not all grades matter," "Judge Hart said it," "The essay that spoke," and even "She didn't need to speak." Under every viral post, thousands of comments came in. What stunned people wasn't just the truth about J.D. Vance. It was how Jasmine responded. No rebuttals, no emotional pleas, no overdone motivational tone. A law student at Columbia wrote, "I used to think staying silent meant weakness. Now I know it's a choice, made from self-respect." Traditional media reacted slower, but once they did, lines were drawn. Right-leaning outlet Eagleet News aired a clipped version of Hart's speech. In their cut, the part about J.D. asking to defer his exams because of depression was removed, leaving only the section praising Jasmine's resolve. That version aired widely with a heated headline, "Do personal struggles prove political capability?" In response, dozens of users reposted the full version with captions like, "Yet again, when the full truth doesn't fit, they trim it." A Reddit forum on legal ethics, RR Legal Ethics, pinned a full translation of Jasmine's thesis, breaking down how she tackled racial bias in civil cases using deep constitutional logic. A Harvard professor commented, "If a white Ivy League student had written this, we'd have made it required reading by now." Then a surprising witness spoke up. The account under Scott B. writes, verified as a conservative white alumnus who studied alongside Jasmine, shared a long Facebook post later circulated tens of thousands of times. "In our last year, I nearly failed administrative law. Jasmine handwritten every class note for me, even while her mother was dying. I never thanked her properly. I don't believe in race-based preferences, but I do believe in fairness. And fairness starts by asking who genuinely studied and who just shares a convincing story." Within 72 hours, universities from Yale and Harvard to Berkeley and Howard issued statements supporting open forums under one unifying idea. Who exactly are we evaluating, and by which measure? A flyer from Yale left a strong impact. Image of a fountain pen resting on her thesis page, captioned, "Not everyone talks, but everyone leaves a mark." Meanwhile, J.D. Vance's office stayed completely silent. No fresh statements, no explanations. His press team rejected all interview invitations, offering only a single repeated reply. "The senator currently has no comment regarding the situation." That silence, unlike Jasmine's, wasn't calm. It was avoiding. And the public noticed the contrast. A senior NBC journalist posted on X, "Two kinds of silence. One froze the room, the other lost all its weight." Amid the storm, Jasmine Crockett did just one thing. No live stream, no talk show features, no press interviews. At precisely 7 a.m. on Tuesday, she posted a single line on her X account. "Not everyone in the same class learns the same message." No hashtags, no mentions, no image. And because of that simplicity, it was shared over 1.2 million times within 48 hours. The Atlantic soon published a 4-page spread titled "The Weight of Not Speaking," an exploration of why the biggest emotional shift came through silence. One quote from the piece spread quickly. "Jasmine didn't argue with J.D. She didn't speak out for fairness. She just let someone else speak when it mattered most. And then she stood still. That wasn't a tactic. That was strength." By the end of the week, a Morning Consult poll showed 72% of people believed academic records don't reflect leadership skill. 64% agreed truth should be evaluated through actions, not transcripts. Just 18% thought J.D. Vance had the standing to question someone else's academic worth. But maybe the strongest reaction didn't come from polls or hashtags. It came from a photo. A student who witnessed the hearing had snapped the moment Jasmine sat with her notebook closed, eyes resting on the thesis Professor Hart had given her. sunlight from the window falling across her fingers. No emotion, no victory, just a quiet stillness. That photo became the backdrop for essays, motivational memes, and posters pinned inside law libraries across the country. No words were added to the image, but everyone got it. No one rushed to exit. The last one to stand wasn't a guest or a politician. It was a janitor quietly entering as only a few remained in the chamber. On the table, Jasmine's thesis still rested. Untouched, not folded, not stained. Beside it, Professor William Hart was still standing, his hand gently holding the edge of the paper as if scared that even a slight move might ruin what everyone was trying to hold on to. Jasmine packed her notebook. No comments, no gratitude, no final remarks like officials often give, because what had to be said was already said, and what shouldn't have been said had been held back. Exactly when mattered most. A few days later, a small-town paper in the Midwest, with no major readership, published an opinion column written by a 16-year-old high schooler. The writer signed only as "Someone Still Learning." The piece went viral across platforms, anchored by a single sentence that stopped readers mid-scroll. "I'm not scared of bad grades. I'm scared of learning without knowing why I'm learning." The article didn't name Jasmine or J.D. Vance, but anyone reading knew it was written in the days after that hearing. The phrasing wasn't polished, but the feeling, it was real. The kind of thing no textbook can ever teach. Soon afterward, colleges from elite schools like Princeton and Yale to Southern community campuses began testing a new idea: reverse feedback sessions, where students could assess professors, not just on paper, but in live conversations. A department chair at the University of Minnesota reportedly said in a staff meeting, "For the first time in years, I realized sometimes we teach without ever asking. Have our students learned anything from how we treat them?" One photo unexpectedly became the symbol of the entire event. It wasn't J.D. lowering his head. It wasn't Professor Hart raising the thesis. It was the moment he stood next to Jasmine without speaking. She didn't glance at him. He didn't glance at her, but his fingers rested lightly on the thesis, and hers sat on her notebook. No spotlight, no dramatic lighting. Just two people standing side by side in a room that had just carried the weightiest dialogue of the year. That picture spread everywhere. No caption, no hashtags, but everyone knew. One outlet reprinted it under a single sentence. "Not everyone speaks, but someone always speaks at the right time, for those who've never felt heard." Jasmine Crockett didn't show up on any morning shows after. No early interviews, no victory essays. She simply got back to work, drafting bills, meeting with voters, occasionally posting brief thoughts online. Then exactly 1 week after the hearing, a journalist caught her stepping out of a private meeting. She was alone, no entourage. When asked, "Do you think you won?" Jasmine paused a few seconds, gave a small smile, and said, "I wasn't there to win. I was there so someone could understand what they needed to." Not long after, The Atlantic named that quiet moment between Jasmine and Professor Hart the political photo of the year. Time magazine called it the instant silence, shifted the mood of a country, and in schools across the nation, students began discussing why we learn, not just to earn scores, but to understand who's grading and why. That afternoon, as attendees slowly trickled out of the hearing room, PBS cameras kept filming. One final moment, cut from the main broadcast, appeared later in behind-the-scenes footage. Jasmine reaching for the exit, hand on the doorknob. But before leaving, she turned back. Light from the window lit half her face. Behind her, the table still held the thesis. She looked at the empty room and whispered, almost to herself, "Sometimes you don't need a transcript to know who learned the right lesson." There were no subtitles, and the editors chose not to add any, because they weren't needed. If you believe intelligence isn't measured by bias, leave a comment below. Where did you learn your most important life lesson? And if someone ever stood up for you, or if you've ever stood up for someone else, hit that follow, because stories like this deserve to be